My older daughter only graduated high school, which is quite embarrassing. There's such a huge gap between her and her younger brother.
The voice criticizing me belongs to my mother. My father nodded along, while my younger brother, sandwiched between us, smiled smugly, clearly aware of the praise directed at him. My brother went to a prestigious university, while I graduated high school and started working. Our parents praised my brother for his hard work, calling him an elite. How did such a gap come to exist between us? My name is Chloe, and I'm a 26-year-old web designer. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska with my grandparents, parents, and younger brother Kevin. Kevin is 7 years younger than me and was the long-awaited son for both my parents and me. Being the firstborn son, Kevin was adored by my parents. They prioritized Kevin's opinions and whims, leaving me neglected most of the time. Our parents didn't treat us equally. Kevin got large toys as birthday presents, but since my birthday was close to Christmas, I'd get a single combined gift. And those gifts were often practical items like study tools or encyclopedias, things a child wouldn't find exciting. When Kevin started playing soccer in a local club, my parents began attending his practices and games almost every week. I was part of the tennis team in middle school, but not even for my final match before retiring did either parent attend. They were busy driving Kevin to practice. I grew up being treated very differently from Kevin. There were days when I felt like crying, but in those moments, Kevin was the one who comforted me. He would talk back to our parents when they compared us, saying things like, "That's not true. Chloe is smarter and even helps me study. She's amazing." A few days after my retirement match, Kevin handed me a tiny bouquet made of flowers he had picked from the park and said, "Great job." Even our grandparents, who lived with us, seemed disturbed by our parents' behavior and often stood up for me. However, before I graduated high school, I lost my grandmother, and soon after, my grandfather passed away as well. Kevin continued to stand by me, but my mother, in particular, didn't seem to like it. She began treating Kevin more harshly.
If you side with Chloe anymore, I'll make you stand outside.
She would threaten him during the freezing winter when snow was starting to fall. Not wanting Kevin to face such treatment, I could only tell him that he didn't need to defend me anymore. Eventually, Kevin stopped standing up for me and instead lived happily, excelling in sports and studies under our parents' protection. As for me, with the back-to-back funerals of my grandparents, my parents claimed they had no savings and outright refused to let me go to college. I had wanted to study design, but it was not allowed, and after graduating high school, I had no choice but to get a job. I landed a clerical job at a design company far from my hometown out of sheer determination. It was a small firm specializing in websites for women, like beauty salons and nail parlors. Unable to give up my dream of working in design, I begged to take on some tasks as an assistant designer, alongside my administrative duties. Watching professional designers work up close every day, I was confronted with harsh realities, but it only fueled my resolve. I became more determined than ever to become a web designer, and the time I spent studying alone grew increasingly precious. I kept my visits to my parents' house to a minimum. Going back only reminded me of their mockery, which made me avoid them even more. Instead, I spent my weekends studying design and taking online courses to gain software expertise. My efforts didn't go unnoticed by the company, and one day I was invited to join the design team. My enthusiasm became well known among the designers, who began sharing helpful resources and connections with me. By the time 3 years had passed, I had grown enough to take on independent projects as a web designer. 8 years after graduating high school, I had become completely accustomed to the work of a web designer. It was around this time that I received news about my brother Kevin's college entrance exams. Apparently, he was aiming for a prestigious private university in the city, and not just any major. He wanted to get into medical school. Thanks to his hard work, Kevin consistently ranked near the top in our area, and his acceptance was almost guaranteed. Remembering how he had supported me when we were younger, I told him I'd like to help in any way I could. A few months later, Kevin successfully got into the prestigious medical school. When I heard the news, I was overjoyed and congratulated him enthusiastically. "Kevin, congratulations. I heard you worked so hard, going to tutoring sessions every day. I'm so happy for you." Kevin thanked me modestly, but then he brought up a concern.
Actually, private medical schools require donations. It's optional, but mom and dad said people from rural areas like us get looked down on if we don't pay. They think we should do it, right? But you know our family's situation. We're barely scraping by with just my tuition and living expenses.
Kevin said he planned to work part-time to cover his living costs, but I knew medical school required an overwhelming amount of study. It was clear he wouldn't be able to keep up if he had to juggle work on top of that. Our parents, with dad as a regular employee and mom working only part-time twice a week, were in no position to pay such a large amount. Even covering the tuition for a private medical school must have been a huge stretch. They were likely counting on my savings. It infuriated me that they wouldn't ask directly, and instead made Kevin bring it up. Still, I agreed to help, hiding my growing disdain for our parents, and covered the donation and related expenses. With this support, Kevin moved into an apartment close to the university and started his new life. His apartment wasn't far from where I lived, so I told him he could rely on me anytime, but perhaps he was too busy enjoying college life. His replies to me were always curt. Despite this, I would still get messages like, "I want to eat this," or "Can you send me that?" So I often arranged deliveries or lent him money, covering the financial support that our parents couldn't provide. Occasionally, we'd go out to eat together, but even then, Kevin would act distant. Outside of the meal itself, he'd ignore me and keep fiddling with his phone. Whenever I asked him anything, he'd brush me off. His cold responses left me increasingly puzzled. At some point, Kevin began treating me with outright indifference. Even today, during our dinner together, it felt like I was forcing him to spend time with me. Trying to lighten the mood, I brought up our parents in an upbeat voice. "Well, as long as you're doing your best, Mom and Dad must be happy." Kevin suddenly looked at me, his face twisting into a sneer as he let out a sarcastic laugh.
Of course, they are. I'm at a prestigious med school, and you're just a high school graduate working as a designer. Mom and Dad aren't worried about you at all. You're doing some low-level job that doesn't even require qualifications.
The harshness of his words sent a chill through me. What do you mean by low level?
Exactly what it sounds like. A web designer, right? These days, anyone can learn how to do that just by looking it up online. Even some of my classmates can make websites. Aren't you embarrassed to have a job like that? Maybe you should try studying a bit and getting a qualification or something, though with a high school diploma, that might be tough for you.
I've worked hard to study and earn my place at this job. Kevin, how could you look down on me like that when you don't know anything? Kevin shot me a sullen glare and clicked his tongue in annoyance.
Mom and Dad tell me on the phone every day. They go on about how great I am for getting into the medical school at a prestigious university and how embarrassing it is to have an older sister who only has a high school diploma. The only reason I even bother contacting you or having dinner with you is because they ask me to. They say, take care of Chloe so she doesn't get any more pathetic. The future star doctor needs to keep an eye on her.
From childhood, my parents constantly compared Kevin and me. Kevin was smart, kind, and dependable, while I, their daughter Chloe, was stupid, slow, and clueless, or so they told me to my face. Memories of those hurtful words flashed through my mind, and I felt my breath grow heavy. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I bowed my head to steady myself. Despite this, Kevin let out a small laugh, as if he thought I might be crying, and walked away. Since moving away for college and gaining his independence, Kevin had completely changed. Surrounded by brilliant peers he'd never encountered back home, my parents' praise seemed all the more credible to him. Hearing them say every day, "Kevin is a true genius, and he's destined to become a great doctor," it's no wonder he began to believe it himself. Their words were always laced with condescension toward me, and it clearly influenced Kevin's behavior. That year during the holidays, I returned home as usual. I had been told to bring Kevin along, so despite his continued coldness toward me, we both headed back to our parents' house. It was Kevin's first time back since starting college, as he had been busy with studies and practicals. Perhaps because of this, our parents completely ignored me the moment we arrived, focusing all their attention on him. At home, Kevin was greeted with a feast, which is steak delivery and other luxurious dishes. Later that evening, our parents invited neighbors, relatives, and even some of Kevin's former classmates for a grand party. Caught up in the atmosphere, Kevin's ego seemed to inflate, and he began boasting loudly to everyone.
Mom keeps asking me to visit more often, but I'm studying at a prestigious private university, in the medical school no less. It's obvious I can't come home often. Plus, medical school isn't something you can do alone. A lot of the work requires teamwork, and if I leave, it messes up the group. Whenever my classmates don't know something, they come to me for help. Honestly, it's exhausting.
I pretended to be busy in the kitchen, preparing dishes and avoiding the scene, but Kevin's booming voice carried through loud and clear. While our parents and relatives adored him, it was clear his bragging wasn't sitting well with the neighbors and former classmates. Finally, perhaps tired of Kevin monopolizing the attention, one of the older neighbors tried to steer the conversation toward me.
Hey, Chloe, you've been working hard too, haven't you? Wasn't it something in design?
But Kevin and my parents immediately dismissed the idea, shaking their heads.
She's trying, I guess, but it's nothing impressive.
That's right. It's embarrassing having a high school graduate as our eldest. The gap between her and Kevin is just so big.
The room fell silent. Many of the people there, including former classmates, were also high school graduates or had kids who were high school graduates. But with all the food and drinks being served, they seemed to hold their tongues, their discomfort evident in their expressions. The only ones oblivious to the tension were my parents and Kevin. Feeling overwhelmed, I decided to quietly slip away. But Kevin stopped me.
You've got some nerve coming back here. I work hard every day to earn the right to come home with pride. But you, no degree, no pride. How can you even show your face here?
Kevin burst into laughter. My parents joined in and chuckled themselves. I froze at his words, anger bubbling up inside me.
Well, good news for you. You don't have to show that face here next year.
Fine. I forced out words in a trembling voice. I felt terrible for the guests who were anxiously watching, but I set down the tray I was holding, walked out of the room, grabbed my coat and bag, and quickly returned. Seeing me ready to leave, Kevin and my parents exchanged smug glances. If that's how you feel, I'll take your advice. I'm never coming back. A fiery anger boiled inside me like magma, but the words that came out of my mouth were ice cold. By this point, I had lost all attachment not only to my parents, but also to Kevin, who I had once believed was on my side. When I said that, my family of 3 gleefully waved me away.
Don't ever show your face here again.
As I made my way to the train station, I suppressed the urge to scream. Visiting my parents' house had always been difficult. While I was working toward becoming a web designer, I used studying as an excuse to stay away. But as I matured into an independent adult, I struggled with the inescapable ties of family. Kevin, being younger and still a student, it might be understandable that he can't imagine the struggles I've faced since entering the workforce. But my parents had raised 2 children, worked, and must have understood, at least a little, what life entails. Even so, they constantly praised Kevin for being brilliant and a genius, inflating his ego while ridiculing me. The immaturity of their words was staggering, and my anger was mixed with a deep sense of disappointment. If I valued my work, I couldn't continue tolerating this toxic dynamic, even if they were my family. Kevin's cruel words only solidified my decision to cut ties with my parents once and for all. A few months later, as the new school year approached, I received a sudden phone call from Kevin. I had heard nothing from him since that day, but now he was messaging me nonstop. I hadn't blocked his number, so I reluctantly answered the phone.
What's going on with my tuition?
Kevin's hesitant voice was tinged with panic. I replied calmly, "I helped cover last year's costs. Are you talking about the enrollment fee and donation from your first year?"
No, I mean for my second year. The university's been sending reminders to pay, but what's happening with it?
What's happening is that I never said I'd pay for it. I could tell from the silence on the other end that Kevin was stunned. It was true that I had dipped heavily into my savings to cover Kevin's enormous costs. As I had told him, I paid for the enrollment fee, the donation, and most of his first-year tuition. However, my savings had taken a major hit, and my plan was to pay future expenses on an as-needed basis. Naturally, the second year's tuition remained unpaid. Given what happened at the end of last year, it was shocking that Kevin thought he could rely on me after practically disowning me. The audacity was almost laughable. Originally, I was only asked to cover the donation, wasn't I? I helped with tuition because I thought it would be a good gesture, but Mom and Dad let you attend a private university because they said they could handle the money, unlike when it was my turn. Or are you saying they let you take the exam knowing they couldn't afford it?
Of course not. But you know, my living expenses and trips, and most of my classmates are rich, and I have to keep up with them. Mom and Dad helped me out with those costs, but when it comes to tuition, they said it's tough and told me to call you.
The truth was, I had a good reason for having some savings left. I had transitioned to a major design firm to further my career in web design. With my proven track record, my salary saw a significant increase. On top of that, since I was constantly busy with work, both my salary and bonuses steadily accumulated. I had shared news of my new job with my parents, so it was clear that from the very beginning, they had factored my financial support into Kevin's education plans. Not only that, but once they realized I could help with both the donation and tuition, it seemed their original savings had been used up on Kevin's leisure activities. Perhaps they got complacent, but I was no longer willing to let myself be taken advantage of. While I could have easily helped with the tuition, I refused Kevin's demands. A few days later, my parents contacted me, and once again, I turned them down. Their anxious, accusatory tone during the call only deepened my resolve. I realized that I no longer had a home to return to. To them, I wasn't family. They just saw me as a source of money. Without consulting me, they had no right to exploit my savings. Kevin began calling me daily, leaving voicemails filled with complaints and pleas. If he had offered a sincere apology, perhaps I might have been willing to trust him again.
Please, Chloe, help me with my tuition. If I don't pay, I'll get kicked out. Scholarships and part-time jobs don't even come close to covering it. You don't want to see a brilliant student like me drop out, right? I promise I'll pay you back once I become a doctor. We're family, so you'll help me, won't you?
That was the kind of message he left on my voicemail over and over again. Some of them even included shocking statements like, "If you're upset about not being able to come home, I'll apologize for you." I backed up all the voicemail recordings and deleted them from my phone. Then I sent Kevin a message and completely blocked his contact. People who look down on others shouldn't become doctors. With that, I cut off all contact with my family and embraced the arrival of a new spring. Through relatives, I later heard that Kevin managed to scrape together enough to pay for his second year using scholarships and loans from various family members. However, there was no money left for his living expenses, forcing him to take up a part-time job. Between the heavy workload of medical school and the demands of exams and practicals, his part-time job didn't go well at all. In the end, he failed several courses and dropped out 6 months later. I had also been sending money home to support my parents, but after declaring my estrangement last year, I had completely stopped. With no way to reconcile, Kevin, with his pride shattered, returned to live with our struggling parents. Despite his talent, there was no money left for him to pursue further education. And yet, he didn't try to find a job in our hometown. Instead, he became a recluse, spending his days playing video games. His frustrations spilled over into nightly arguments, as former classmates who lived nearby told me. Having doted on him for so long, my parents couldn't stand up to him. Neighbors told me that whenever they saw my parents outside, they looked utterly exhausted. Nobody dared to speak to them anymore, treating them like pariahs. One day, under the strain of all this stress, my father got involved in an incident. On his way to work, he was caught groping a woman on the train. Other passengers noticed, and he was handed over to the police. Although the case didn't go to court due to a settlement, the scandal led to his employer asking him to resign. The incident became widely known at his workplace, and unable to face the humiliation, he accepted the resignation. My mother tried to find work, but with only part-time experience, she couldn't secure any well-paying job. Both my parents tried reaching out to me through relatives, but their requests were always high-handed and commanding. The relatives, realizing where the real problem lay, eventually stopped relaying their messages. With that, my ties to my family grew even weaker, allowing me to return to a peaceful life. According to relatives, my father, who was now unemployed, and Kevin, who had become a shut-in, were the subjects of worsening gossip. Apparently, their bad reputations only isolated them further from the community. Perhaps unable to bear the situation, my mother eventually disappeared without a word. and I've heard that she is now unreachable. The remaining family members, with no source of income, are reportedly living on public assistance, scraping by. A warm connection with their neighbors might offer some comfort, but given how they've treated others, it's unlikely they'll find much understanding. As for me, I'm steadily advancing in my design career. I've been selected to participate in a high-profile projects that will prominently feature my name on the front stage. Using this opportunity as a stepping stone, I've decided to finally pursue a long-held dream. That dream is going to college. I've managed to save up enough money and plan to begin the process once my next project settles down. In the future, I'm considering becoming independent, so I'd like to study not just design, but also business management. The thought of this new challenge fills me with excitement,